Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy Podcast. My name is Blake. I'm here with Pastor Doug and Pastor Kyle. We're three pastors of Living Springs Church, and we get to take you on an adventure through the twists and turns of our faith, only because you send in questions. So thank you for sending in your questions, and we will try to answer them best we can today and in the future as well. So thank you for that. I do think we got some AAR, so let's jump in there.
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
Perfect. So it says, last week you spoke about the 44,003 denominations of Christianity, which I'll let you guys clarify in a second. The question says, how many are from the line of Catholics?
So approximately 44,003.
Yeah.
We want to be clear on that. We do not have a running tally.
No.
And if last week there was 44,003, it's probably different this week.
Yeah, they've probably split off more.
Somewhere.
We're not counting that some have merged back together in unity of the body of Jesus.
Yeah, there you go.
And I'm sure that does happen. But there's more fracturing than merging.
Totally.
And so if that number was accurate last week, it would not surprise me if it wasn't accurate this week.
Correct.
And some churches close, right? So,
But denominations.
true.
Right?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so
Now,
we were
there's
actually...
probably some individual churches that refuse to be part of any kind of banner and therefore count as a denomination.
Right.
I don't know where these numbers are actually have come from, but I've heard it cited a number of times. Is the
Okay.
approximate number is around 44,000 denominations.
44,000. Okay.
And so there's two ways to answer this.
Yeah.
The first way is all of them.
Correct.
Because all of them originally come from the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Catholic, for those of us who might not be aware of this, if you look at a small c Catholic, that's all of us. Catholic literally just means universal.
Yep.
And so when people talk about the Catholic Church, and we've in this church done creeds at various times, and one of the creeds has Catholic, and you and I have talked about that at various times.
And by talked, you mean debated.
Yes, because you're such a legalist when it comes to the creeds. The word Catholic just means universal.
Yep.
If it's a small c, large C, Roman Catholic, represents what we know as and what we think of as the Catholic Church.
Yep.
So all of them come from the line of the Catholic Church.
Yep. The other way to answer it then is none of them. There are, there's even a nuance to that answer. Within the Catholic Church, there are multiple different expressions.
Correct.
Like many people have heard of, like the Franciscan monks, and so there's different sects within it that think and practice in slightly different ways, but they all still submit to the one singular pope in the system that is the church and follow its Eucharistic practice, and therefore the receiving of one communion. So there's differences within the one whole,
Which is one of the beautiful things about Catholicism that I appreciate, is
Hugely.
that they are able to hold some of those differences and maintain unity.
Totally.
Yep.
So then there's either all of them have gone from the line of it, or really just maybe one or two that broke off at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Everything else has subsequently come from there. The Orthodox Church Eucharist is still recognized by the Catholic Church to qualify as valid, which is an interesting one. So they are in some ways related and in good enough relationship that the Catholic Church recognizes the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Eucharist as Catholic.
They've had 500 more years to mend those fences, though.
Correct.
So
We Protestants are still angry. And so depending on how you want to look at it, as Doug alluded to last week, the term Protestant literally is in protest of, in resistance to. Now, there are many early Protestant writings that were still grieving over the fact that they were resisting and protesting away from the Catholic Church, the things that they loved and longed for. And their liturgy early on still looked a lot more Catholic, in air quotes for those that are listening in audio only, than Protestant churches do now.
Absolutely.
And so it depends on what you define as from that line. But all of them, I lean towards that former answer of all of them have come from that and broken off from there.
I think we also don't tend to think about the fact that when they broke off, there were theological differences that over time became practice differences and cultural differences, right? The example would be you had these theological differences that ended up causing the elevation of the sermon above
Over the communion table.
over the communion table, right? And I think it was Zwingli who, like, the communion table was the center of the church for 1,500 years. And I'd encourage you.
Francis Chan had a sermon on that.
Yeah, there's a Francis. He does a talk on Preston Sprinkle's podcast where he talks about communion and calling the church back to communion that I listened to 5 or 6 years ago. That was just powerful, and I loved it. But he's the guy who just in the last 5 or 10 years been all about reestablishing the practice of communion as central to our faith, because it was for 1,500 years. And what happened was you had this need to, desire from the leaders of the church to teach on some of the differences and what we are and how we are different and how we are protesting, that ended up causing the sermon to be elevated to the place that it is now central in Protestant churches.
Yep.
And I think it was Zwingli who moved the communion table to put the pulpit at the center.
Yep. I
Interesting.
would even argue there's some places now that have even shifted speaking out of the way to music being, though it's not the high point in the order of the gathering, of importance. There are many who have shifted that focus.
But people would like voluntarily say the message is the most important.
yes. But when
People
you-
would have they'd feel odd about saying,
Yeah.
No,
or
I don't think they
uncomfortable.
would, because
You
there
don't
were
think?
because there are people who will honestly say that they go to a church for
For the music.
the music. That is the deciding factor of what causes them to choose their church. So even though it may be in a different order, or maybe it's still the Protestant order of things, that is the high point of the sermon of the service for them. That is the point that is most important to them.
But do you think they'd feel uncomfortable in like saying that if you were like, so in all of church or what you do
Depends
at a
how you
gathering,
phrase it.
what is the most important thing?
I don't think
Like-
they'd elevate and say, I like the music more than the sermon that bluntly. It would be phrases along the lines of, I just love connecting with the presence
The
of
experience.
God. And like they'd say it
Yes.
that way, and meaning it's through the practice of music.
And they would also say
that I
through
feel
their
that.
actions
Yeah.
that
Right.
they would maybe choose a church based on that.
Yeah.
And
Right.
maybe I'm just old and I just feel like you're almost saying heresy if you didn't say the sermon's the most important part, right? But
But again, that's a funny thing because
that
that's
wasn't-
500 years old.
Yeah.
That is not the early church.
Yeah.
And that is not even the Middle Ages church up until
totally.
the Protestant movement, right?
And I love the way our church currently does communion every week, and you know how we've turned the chairs towards the table and made that like it makes so much sense to me. In the practice, going, well, yeah, like we sing songs, that's great, and I would never downplay that. There is a lot that happens in that moment where we're praising or we're praying or we're doing whatever in worship of God, right? The sermon, of course, that's where we get fed. But out of all the things Jesus told us to do, and the thing that like centers me on Christ is the communion table, right?
Yeah.
Like that makes sense. So,
But when you think about the law of unintended consequences,
Mm-hmm.
right? When the communion table was the center, and there was still a homily in the Catholic Church, but the high point was and in the Catholic Church, the belief, transubstantiation, the very real presence of the body and the blood of Christ made communion the high point.
Yep.
You shift that to the sermon becoming the high point, and you end up with the celebrity pastor,
yeah.
right? Well, now you end up, and then you think about the outgrowth of that is megachurches. And like there's a lot of unintended consequences, and the fact that the face of many churches is the pastor.
Yep.
But the beauty of communion as the high point of the service is it's Christ
Yep.
that is the face of the church, right? You don't have the celebrity priests in the Catholic Church the way you have. I mean, you have the Pope that people think of, but you don't have the celebrity pastors, the celebrity priests in the same way. And I think there's an outflow of unintended consequences that happens there that is unfortunate, because when you make somebody other than Christ the face of the church, you then diminish the reality of the strength of the body is supposed to be the body, and you diminish and you open yourself up to the possibility when that person fails, it has huge ramifications over that church and beyond.
That's an interesting statement about the mega church. Like, and I'm not disagreeing with what you say. I'm just kind of thinking it through from my perspective or thinking is, like you just, and we have a question coming up about your pilgrimage, said you visited like tiny churches. There's just a room and 50 people or whatever, 20 people could be in that room together. If the Eucharist is a high point, you don't need a lot of people gathered together to give that momentum. Like you can just go and see Jesus, right? Music, if music is your high point, obviously the more people you get in the room, the better, right? Like I remember the first time we went to YC, that was the biggest, people singing a worship song that I'd ever heard. You get, close to 20,000 people singing together and you're like, whoa, this is like close to heaven. Like I heard so many people say this, right? If the sermon is the most important thing, if someone can speak well, obviously they're going to attract a lot of people, right? So then the mega church you need the church to grow in order for those things to continue to have meaning, right? But the Eucharist doesn't do that.
No, it keeps that focus on Christ and on the body of Christ, which the church should be faceless in the sense of, like, if we think of a face, it should be Jesus, who none of us have ever seen.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I have another question. I'm the host, so I can ask questions whenever I want. Just making the rules up right now.
Submit it via the website, and we'll answer it in a couple of months when we get to it.
Our Catholic and Protestant conversation last week, I was thinking one of the things that we've even teased about is, the Protestant Reformation put the Bible in everyone's hands. And then that was also something that caused a lot of trouble and lots of denominations for sure. One of the things that put the Protestant Reformation and put the Bible in everybody's hands was translating it into the language that the people could speak. Because I believe up to some point, it was always in Latin, right? And so when did the Catholic Church stop doing their homilies in Latin or use the common language? When did they use a translated Bible? Do you know
I don't know that off by hand, but I do know on the opposite side, there are still many people devoted to going to a Latin Catholic service. So that's readily available in many places.
Still there.
So you can still go to that. And the idea is, now, it's slightly inaccurate. They want to come to Scripture as it is versus the other way around, make Scripture fit to me.
Right.
It's a similar level of thinking, as far as I understand it, to why the majority of Muslims refuse to use a translated Quran.
Right.
Because I need to approach the text as it is, not the opposite.
I like that. It just made me think of, and I'd never thought that way before because, of course, being a Protestant and just growing up in the churches I grew up in, we think of the Protestant Reformation as such a good thing and that we learned, maybe a better way to do church and whatever else. But I was like, there's no way that happened without the Catholic Church also doing some inward looking and going, maybe we're not breaking off, but maybe we need to change our practices, right? Yeah.
No, I'm not sure where. That's something we'll have to look into and follow up on.
I don't know. Maybe I'll try and find an answer to my own question.
One last
you guys can't help me out
on this AER. Those that have broke are from the line of Catholics. I guess the maybe last and maybe most fence city answer. So I'm taking your chair here, Blake. Is any church that can agree with the creeds really is still within that line?
Still a universal church.
Yeah.
With the Roman Catholic Church would not say that.
That's my take, and I'm fully acknowledging that because the Catholics would say anybody outside of them is not a part of it because they're not receiving Catholic Eucharist.
Okay.
Depending on how hard a line, because again, within the Catholic Church, there would be
not on that one.
There would be Catholics.
There'll be people who will give service to. Yeah, you're another Christian, but the minute you stop and talk about Eucharist, any Eucharist outside of Catholic is not then of the church.
I agree.
And
I agree with you.
That's not a part of that succession is actually not a real leader. So this is totally my take. This is not what the Catholic Church would say, but it's anybody who can agree with the creeds then would be from that line because you're agreeing to that standard that was set in both the Nicene and then Apostles' Creed. We are affirming that these are the beliefs that we will hold.
I love this podcast. I love learning stuff. That's something I would never think of. Like when this question originally came in, it was like, why, what's the difference between the Catholic and Protestant church?
Yeah.
And I think that from a Protestant way, the Eucharist would not be the first thing that I would have shared previous to the answer to this question. But interesting that you say the Catholics, that would be their biggest thing.
Yeah. Which isn't even in their creeds, which is the interesting part.
Right.
right? Like that is a later high value practice for them.
Yeah.
And the priesthood. They're integral to Catholic thinking. But when what we would now refer to as Catholic history said, what do we need to hold in common? The creeds of the thing.
Right.
Right. And so that, and even within that is we believe in one holy Catholic church, one universal church that is then centered around these things.
But it was written before we split up into 44,000 denominations.
Correct. And it was set up before the papacy at that same level that we have now. There were still bishops and maybe even the term pope already floating around, but not to that same degree, not to the universal width, and not the differences of theology floating around that we had later. We don't have the precedent set for protest, all those things that have come in since.
Yeah.
The idea of transubstantiation is not articulated at those times.
Yeah.
So there's a big difference in it there.
Yeah, everything has been evolving since its inception.
Yep.
Right? And we think about the Catholic Church with its tradition, and we go, well, that's the way it always was.
Yep.
But it evolved to become what it is.
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally.
So,
All right. Well, let's jump into our first question of the day. What are you guys' favorite worship song that we used to do or still do today, and why is it your favorite?
I'm resisting jumping into my joke answer first, but I can't now that I've vocalized that. I was telling you guys before the podcast, we introduced our kids to He Touched Me. We just have a good laugh any time that song gets played in our house. He touched me. And sing that over and over again. But all jokes aside, I've got a pretty clear leader in narrowing it into this worship song set or terminology, assuming that as a genre of music would be All Hail King Jesus. That one is about Jesus, tells the narrative of his story and redemption. Lyrically is sound, musically is more fun, I think, in some ways than others, at least on the drum set for me. So that one far and away is my favorite in that worship genre.
I have a really hard time picking song. One. If I had to, it would be one of two.
Okay.
And because they're so similar thematically.
Right.
Which would be As It Is in Heaven or the Lord's Prayer.
Right.
Because you're singing the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
Which I just love.
Yeah.
I love both of those songs for that very reason.
Yeah.
We don't think about the singing that we do as a type of prayer. Yeah. And so taking some time to sing a prayer, I love that.
Cool.
But on a slightly wider scope, I would think, and this would be speaking to you, Jeremy Riddle or Matt Maher.
Okay, yeah.
Would be the two guys more than anybody else.
Yeah.
That if I'm going to listen to worship music, those are my two go-tos.
Still standing by Mumford & Sons' newest album is the Christian album of the year, but that doesn't count as worship music. The song Surrender is on regular play for me.
If we're just talking Christian songs, that's different. And I got a lot of different...
That's why I said I'm going to narrow into worship songs as a genre. Yeah.
For me, I think right now still is Christ is Lower Still. Ever since you guys first introduced me to that song.
That's a top.
In one of our staff meetings, like I regularly play that as I go to sleep. Like I don't know, that song just, it just puts me in such a perspective of what Christ is doing for me, right?
Yep.
And especially at the end of my day, kind of contemplating through the day, thinking, I still didn't do as good as I could have today, right? Like another day chalked up to the fact that I need Christ and that he's there for me. So I love that song. I was thinking of the past, and I don't know music like you guys do, so I have trouble even remembering like the names of songs, and they have meaning in a moment because it's cool, and then the new song comes, and then I think of that one, right? But we used to sing Lord, I Lift Your Name on High when I was doing camp ministry, and there was like actions to it and the kids would play. But that one always was cool. I just loved walking into kids at camp sing that song. And I remember one time even walking up to the chapel, like I was outside doing something, and I was coming to chapel late and they were already starting singing, and they were singing that song, and I was just standing outside going, this is cool. Like when kids are singing to Jesus. So that one kind of sticks.
That is one that was so big for so long, and part of the wonder of that was it was so easy to play, but you could just get some cool things that you could get people enjoying singing that song so easily. So there have been ones that throughout the years that have been like, man, that song is really significant to me. And there are ones that have been like, sometimes I've tried to introduce them in the church and they just don't catch on in the church, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
Not every song does, but yeah, that was a gooder. That's way back though.
Yeah, totally.
That's probably before Kyle's time.
No, I know that one. That was when I played that one early when I started drumming. Yeah.
Oh, I assumed you were too young for that.
I was going to say you would have been the kid at camp that I would have been directing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah. I started drums 2003.
Well, I'm just gonna hang on. I'm just
And
gonna
so
look up
I
when
played
that
within
song.
the first 2 years at church.
I did camp 2001 to 2005, I think, were our years that we were directing. So,
and we played that song in the church that I was in at the time.
Yeah.
Hang on, let's see when it was released. 1989.
Wow.
So by 2002, that was an oldie but
That
a
was
goodie.
an old song, yeah.
Now I feel like back then it took longer for songs to get
because
into
they'd be played
rotation.
locally in whatever environment they'd been written, and then often not get out into rotation past that.
Yeah, there was no
There's nobody
years.
waiting for the
there was no
new worship
the
album.
YouTube to watch and
Yeah, so I remember in church growing up, like 1 or 2 times a year, we would do a new song.
Yeah.
Because the guy who led worship every week, who was not a worship pastor,
Yeah.
we were in a small church in a small town,
Yeah.
but just a great piano player.
Yeah.
He would occasionally hear a new song and he would play it. But what was always interesting that not a thing so much anymore was like you'd hear the song and then you'd remember it.
Yeah.
And you take it back. So everybody, you went to a different church. Everybody sang
Played
it a
it
little bit
different.
different.
Totally, I remember that,
Sometimes
yeah.
there'd be an extra bar here, or the vocal melody would change slightly because there was so much personal interpretation from wherever you heard it to then putting it into, and it was so cool. But at the same time, if you like, I can remember. You go to a funeral in a different church, and they're like, "We're going to sing this song," and all the people. If you were there from a different church, at some point you're belting out something, and all of a sudden you're doing a solo, and you're like, "Oh,
yeah, they don't do that here. I appreciate the mission trips I've gone on and going to churches where they have speaking a different language, and then recognizing a song, like they're doing their worship music, and some of it you're like, I have no idea what this song is, I don't know the words. And then all of a sudden they're playing a song, you're like, well, hang on, I know this one. So
I've often wondered, did they just take the vocal melody and totally change thematically to make the melody match, or is it thematically the same song when I've heard that?
Yeah.
Because that could be very complicated.
yeah, because you couldn't just directly word for word translate a song. That wouldn't work.
Yeah. Well, the one I think of is Lord, I Lift Your Name on High, which has been put in many different languages.
Yeah.
Are they saying Lord, I Lift Your Name on High in their language, or are they singing something totally different?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I don't know.
Good questions. We always get more questions than we do answers. I don't know.
Totally.
All right. In addition to living my life faithfully and praying and reading the Bible with my son, how can I better encourage his faith? He is not even a teenager yet and claims he doesn't believe in God. I encourage his questions and don't force my faith on him, but it still hurts my heart to hear him have such blatant disregard for God and faith in general. Any additional suggestions on how to better reveal Christ to him? I pray that his heart will be soft and open to God, but still wish there were more tangible things I could do.
I can empathize with the pain in this question. And I think many parents have felt that. You have kids and you do what you can to help them grow in the faith, and sometimes they don't continue in the faith, and that is a very hard thing. I would encourage you to keep doing the things you're doing, living your life faithfully, praying with your son, reading the Bible with your son, and praying for your son. Ultimately, there's an element of what salvation is that is beyond us, right?
Yeah.
Paul says in Corinthians, I planted and Apollos watered, but God brought the growth. And I think sometimes we're trying to bring growth and we cannot.
Yep.
Keep planting and keep watering, keep praying for God to bring the growth.
Yeah.
And I don't want to minimize that,
No.
but I don't know what else to offer you.
Yeah. I would also encourage don't panic when you hear those things.
Yep.
Like you never know what's going on in those. I have experienced this in our house where my daughter has talked about I don't believe in God, And then a couple days later, it's, Dad, could you pray for me? And so it's this kind of battle in a post-Christian world, especially where the kids are pulling this in. My son, who's in grade 2, just finished grade 2, they're finishing today, has these grandiose opinions about Donald Trump. I'm like, I don't think you know a single opinion about Donald Trump, but he and his friends get talking, and Trump's the worst. Like, okay. So there's this cultural kind of essence that's coming around a lot of things. And so if a grade 2 kid can have an opinion that he thinks is strong on the president of the United States and politics, I think we also are kind of pulling in this post-Christian attitude in our kids' schools. And my kids are in a Christian program, and they still pull some of that in. Where pushing away from the parents is happening. I remember reading the study that was put out by the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada and a couple other partners called Hemorrhaging Faith. You might have been still youth pastoring during that one. If you were Jason.
I was not, but I read that.
Canada, unlike the States, like we always heard the stats like, oh, we're losing our kids when they leave high school and go to university.
Absolutely.
Canada, that was never true. It was between grades 6 and 8 where we were losing our kids from the faith as they were becoming adults. And I could only assume that's going to probably pull earlier as kids are exposed to social media and all that, even if like my kids are not, but they're catching their friends who are on a regular basis. So don't panic. Because I think kids are just coming along the cultural ideas and continue to plant these seeds because fruit takes time. And so as we plant these, as you are faithful, as you do pray with them, as you hear their questions, as you allow them to articulate these frustrations, there needs to be this distancing of a kid from their parent only to come around to what becomes real to them over time. And so just remain faithful in all that you're doing, and praying for them is absolutely, I think, the number one. But then the other thing I wanted to cite was I did read a book that, again, Barna Research did. And then they wrote this book. I can't remember who the author was that they partnered with to kind of write around the statistics they had collected. And it jumped out to me, and I've cited it many times. The number one indicator of a child holding onto their faith was not youth group attendance, church attendance, mission trips, camps, nothing like that. It was, do you have 2 non-familial adults in your kid's life who love Jesus in front of them? That was it. Like far and away the number one indicator of a kid who would hold on to their faith. And so I'd love to say to you, you can't do this all. And not just from a practical standpoint, but from a statistical one. It's unlikely you can be them. We see even Mary struggle to understand who Jesus was in his early ministry. We see Jesus' local town not be able to see him for who he was. Because of the proximity and closeness, that I can't help but there's some line and principle there of like, our kids need their faith to be distinct from their parents, and so we need to have that group of people in them. I've expressed to a number of friends now, I want to be that for your kid, and I hope you would be able to return the same favor for mine. Because there'll be times when I cannot be the one who speaks to them for these matters, so I want you to be in my life, not just for our friendship, but for my kids to see that in somebody else. And so I've just been blunt about that with some of my friends. That's part of almost my expectation. I will do that for your kid, and I've gone out of my way to be intentional in their kids' lives, hoping that would be reciprocated, because there will come a day when parents' words are not enough, and kids have to push away, and that's a normal thing. So who's there in that void?
If I could just reinforce something you just said.
Yeah.
It was 2 non-familial adults who love Jesus.
Yeah.
Not who attend church.
Nope.
And I'm not disparaging any person.
Yep.
But sometimes we confuse those. They go to church, they love Jesus.
Yep.
They need to see that these people live their faith outside of church.
Yep.
Right? It's not just, oh, that person goes to church and then that's it.
Yep.
Right? Find people who live their faith.
Yep.
And that's a big deal. I think of Eugene Peterson's book. I think it's in The Pastor, where he talks, or maybe it's Burning in My Bones, where he talks about the first time he was mentored was by that guy in the church that he grew up with, who was a gruff old man, who he was like, will you be my mentor? Because he'd gone to a pastor, and the pastor like had no time for him and didn't really model Christ in any way. And this was like an old guy who he was a little bit afraid of. He was 18 or 19. And someone was like, you should go let that guy be your mentor. And so he went up to the guy, was like, sure, meet me Tuesday nights at the church. And they walked around fixing things in the church and just talked. And that guy modeled Jesus for him. And now years later, he's writing this book in his 60s.
Yeah.
I think it was the pastor, his memoir, and he's referencing back to the impact of that person in his life decades before.
Yeah, I think that is so true. Something else I just think of is just my own family and things that I've watched, like doing youth ministry for a lot of years and, doing adult ministry now. Kids do come back to the faith, right? I think like kids that leave to some degree anyways. We have people that come in our church regularly who are now in their 30s, 40s, whatever. And they're like, I just felt like I needed to come back to church, right? Or I need to check it out. One of the highest things that I, in my family, like just enjoy, or I'm like, okay, maybe we're doing something right. Yeah. My daughter last year moved back in with us, and she said she'd been sitting on a beach with a whole bunch of people, and they'd all been like drinking and doing whatever, and they were all complaining about their parents and how crappy their lives were and broken relationships all over. And my daughter's like, yeah. And then it was like, hang on. Like, actually, my mom and dad are okay. There's no broken relationships in our family. Right. Like, there's actually a settled structure there, and she moved back home, right? So I take that as a point of like, maybe we have something here that is different than the world, right? Yep. So I encourage parents, like, you can't make your kids have a faith, but you can work on yours, right? So work on your faith, be that model, because you never know when, that could be back. And then even my son's girlfriend last weekend was talking to us and just saying that our son complains about the home and all the rest and things. And she's like, he doesn't even know what he has here. She comes from a broken home and did not grow up in a Christian family at all. And she just talks about just simple morals and just, again, the settledness and peace that's in the home. And she's like, so when your son's like saying it's so crappy, she's like, he has no idea, right? So I think those are the things that we can actually do for our kids. I'd encourage you, keep living faithfully.
Yeah. If I could just throw out a book recommendation.
Sure.
Henry Nouwen's The Return of the Prodigal Son for somebody who's a parent.
Yeah.
And specifically the last section on the father. I'm not going to say any more than that.
Yeah.
But just as a challenge of something to live into for every parent.
Yeah.
It is that is such a beautifully powerful picture in the third part. And the whole book is amazing.
Oh,
not
phenomenal.
discounting the entire book.
Yeah.
And you and I chatted about it after you did for book club, and the middle section was the most significant for you.
Yeah.
But for me, just maybe stage of life, whatever, who knows? For me, that last section. But I think when you think about it as a parent, that last section is beautiful.
Yeah. I think the other, just to add on, one benefit of those other people is it rounds out what you can't offer your kid, either because of you're too similar or you're too different. I think of my relationship with my dad, and I know my dad is wired very differently than I am. And he was living his faith the way he knew how and did it to the best of his abilities. Mine, I wanted to ask more questions, and that wasn't how dad was wired. And so I didn't have that. If I had had somebody in my life at that time where I could have bounced those things off of, it could have just been different. And so there's a lot of times where I bump my heads with my kids, or I can't offer them something just because of how I'm just not wired that way. I know much more cold to my son than my wife is. Like to use that example, like, God, toughen up, get moving on, whatever it may be. And so to his broken wrist for 2 days.
I was going to say, there's a story to this one.
As soon as you said that, I'm like, how'd that work for you?
And so learning even where those people in your kid's life come in to be able to balance out what you can't offer them in the faith too is also really important.
I think that is the result of the transient world we live in the 21st century. And again, unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying you shouldn't move away from your family.
Yeah.
I moved 3,000 kilometers away from where I grew up.
Yeah.
Right? But the reality is, if you could go back 200-300 years, you talk about my pilgrimage, these small villages that people grew up in, where I'm not saying everything was perfect, but the one thing you did have was an extended family. Beyond just the parents to look to, there were adults all around you who knew you and who you knew.
Yeah. Which,
I was going to say, you say familial.
Not family.
Not family, yet I do have the benefit. I'm very blessed to have family around. And we have told our kids many times, if you can't talk to me about this, call your grandparents, call Uncle Derek. That's their go-to quite a bit. And our kids have, and even my brothers to some extent, it's like, Go see them, right?
Yeah.
And we've had nieces and nephews show up at our door.
Yeah.
My mom.
Yeah.
All right, let's have a chat, right?
And you might say the same thing, but it'll be heard different.
Yeah.
To Doug's point, just because you can't, you can move away. I also think there's probably something we should consider in how flippantly or casually we do so. That I've noticed our desire as adults to like move to the better job and provide for our family that way or whatever career opportunity can come at the cost of the kids so often. That we think they'll recover and like they're plastic enough that they will find hope in the new church, or will connection. But I think we should consider more carefully when we're making those moves into what end and what cost we're paying to get that maybe career move or that comfortable living. Doug and I, we've talked about this before of like in our years of youth ministry combined, and Blake, maybe you can chime in if you agree.
This hits home, so
If
go ahead.
somebody moved their kids during youth group, their kids never connected middle of the way through, or very rarely, if ever.
It was a struggle.
Connected to the youth group and therefore pulled away from church and often fell away. But we thought, well, that other church, we'll find a good church where we go to and we'll make it work. Or even if you're staying in the same geographic house, but you're going, well, let's change churches for whatever reason. I'm not saying there can't be valid ones at times.
Yeah.
But how casually that has become a cultural thing. And I'm not trying to just sell you on that as a pastor at a church who wants to keep our congregants. If you just move churches across town, those kids are going to have a hard time connecting to a new group, new place, and then that will have fruit of pulling away from church. And so be consistent with your church. Again, I know it sounds because of what all of us have heard about pastors. Like we're not just trying to keep you because we like having our congregation the same size. Like for your kids, put up with our nonsense and our ways that we fail you, so that they can be a part of those things, and they'll leave after if you need to.
That was spoken about in the Benedict option book. I really like that.
Right.
That just
Forgot that part.
Meaning to living in your community, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that hits home with me. I am a pastor, Kyle, and I moved churches while my kids were teens, and there is definitely a cost. Like I think that is probably a regret. I can think of all the wonderful things about coming to this church, and I love it, and all the rest. And my kids actually have started to connect a little bit now, but they definitely did not get the youth experience. Like definitely, but by decisions my wife and I made had impact on my kids in those youth years, and probably made it harder for them to continue in the faith. Not that they would have fallen away, or we can't make our kids choose things, but I made it harder.
But I would just say, even if you moved before you had kids, right? Like we moved to Airdrie before we ever had kids. The responsibility when you do have kids is to try and help to extend
their community
beyond your family. Totally. And there is sometimes in the 21st century just we live in these silos, and we think, well, I can be all my kids need, or sometimes it's fear-based, right? I don't know who's out there, and I don't know what they might do to my kid, so I'm not going to expose them to anything, or I'm not going to give them the opportunity to get close to anyone. And it doesn't, and I'm not, you want to have wisdom for sure, and I'm not saying you have to do everything, but your kids need that extended community in the same way that a married couple can't be all to each other and that's it, right? You're the only person I ever need, and I don't need anyone else. That doesn't often end well.
I can't remember who wrote the book Spiritual Friendship. This is a little bit of a down the rabbit trail, but that's kind of what they talked about in the book too, of making commitments to one another through friendship for the sake of that. And it even came down to, I was talking with somebody at a conference about that book. I remember like they were discerning if they were going to move, they were a pastor and move to another church. And they actually then brought those people that they committed the friendship to. And then those people actually said, I don't think you should. And they stayed because of the friendship commitment that they had made to those people over the opportunity. And so it cost them something to not, right? And we're so hesitant around such commitments and such people speaking into our lives in today's world.
The value is this individualistic, get as much as I can, move up the ladder, all those things. Like that's our value in our culture for sure.
But conversely, those people may reinforce the sense of you need to move. Right? I have a guy I know who was in BC, who was in a church, and he'd been there 20 plus years and had an opportunity to go to another church. He brought his board and trusted friends early on into the process. and told his church early on in the process about this possibility
Yeah.
and invited everyone to pray. And in the end, he moved on.
Yeah.
Right? With the endorsement and the blessing of the church that, we feel like God is in this somehow at pain that this loved relationship is going to end.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it was or wasn't, but it was. I remember reading about it and talking to this person about it and going, that is so amazing.
Yeah.
Well, that's in community again compared to the individualistic. This is good for me, right?
But there's a lot of faith in your church as a
Absolutely.
pastor to say this thing has come my way, and I sense maybe God is in it. Will you guys pray with me?
Yeah.
And to trust the church, it was beautiful, and I so loved it. And I thought probably his departure was a beautifully sorrowful one. Like there would have been sadness, but there would have been so much. Like oftentimes, the pastor just stands up and is like, "I got another job offer.
See you later."
And I'm gone. Right?
Yeah.
And there's this sense of,
What happened?
wait, you're the guy who's been calling us to be community for the last number of years. You're the guy who's been saying we're together in this.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I have had church members who've shared stories of pain like that.
Yeah.
That things are said that are then not lived out.
Yeah.
And I was like, what a beautiful, beautiful picture to do it that way.
No,
To committing people into your kids' lives that I think can speak into them and your life in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we probably got time for this one more, I think.
Well, okay, but wait. This question is really addressed to you, so let me read it.
Okay.
In relation to Blake's sermon on greed in February and his references to tithing, it made me wonder if someone is tithing the traditional 10%, whether it should be on gross or net income. I would imagine most people would do it on net income. But wouldn't that mean that our first fruits are going to the government and not God? Or does that not matter since that is not money we have any control over? Not looking to be dogmatic on it, just curious about what you guys would have to say about it.
I remember you, Doug. You've spoken so many good things into my life and hard things. I cannot remember why or how we had this conversation when we were talking about tithing. I assume you tithed the traditional 10% of the time. I did. But you realized in the conversation that I was tithing on my net, which I'd been doing for years. Yeah. And you said it should be on your gross. Like that's the full amount. Like you're not tithing on the full amount. And I was like, what? Take off. Because as anybody who's heard my series on, or my sermon on tithing knows, I am cheap. So I was like, I've already committed to giving God 10%. I'm not giving him any more, right? But then this realization that, yes, I wasn't tithing on the whole amount. So that changed the way my wife and I started giving money. And that actually turned into a pretty cool thing because we prayed about it and decided that we were going to continue to give the church our net amount because we'd always done that. But the difference between the gross and the net, we were just giving away. We were praying each week and giving away. Now we don't necessarily do that practice anymore, but there was a time, I'd say for a year or two, where we were like intentionally praying. We have this much money. Who do we give it to? Right. So yeah. But I don't know. Lots of thoughts there. I'll let you guys jump in. But is it that dogmatic? Do we have to be that way? I think on money and tithing and how we give, a lot of that to me is based on my conviction. Like, how do we pray? Am I letting God be in control of my resources? I think that's the first question. And then how do we respond to that? So,
yeah. I think we had a question about this similar, like right after your sermon that came in, and this one's been buried a little bit deeper into the list,
right,
just from when it came in. But my stance really stays the same. Is I think tithing is a wonderful idea, but it is not a New Testament one at all. Mm-hmm. And so if you need it and want to use it as a metric, we're told God loves a cheerful giver. Wherever you are able to do what you are joyful to be able to give around. If you feel conviction that you're not quite where you're supposed to be, listen to that. But the New Testament does not have tithing because there's no longer a focus on the Levitical system, which is to support them in the temple and the tabernacle and all those things, which is what that system was for in practical use of trusting God with our finances. But there's a practical use of let's cover their expenses, which is no longer a thing. The New Testament principle, if you want to go there, sell everything and give it to the church and trust them to take care of you out of those funds. The New Testament way of doing things, which we are not endorsing even that. The more New Testament practical, we don't have the systems set up to even from our financial end do it that way.
But that's not actually accurate either. Because if
what
you
way?
look at Ananias and Sapphira,
Yeah.
the problem is not that they withheld. The
No.
problem is that they lied.
Correct.
And so it's not a commandment to give everything and trust the church.
Yeah.
It was just a radical generosity that was birthed out of the movement of God in their
Yes.
life. And when we take what is done by the Spirit and make it a law,
Yes.
we are always going to end up in trouble.
Yes, and that is a descriptive part of the New Testament in Acts chapter 2, not prescriptive.
Yeah.
But that's the closest we get to what was happening in the new church. That was it. There's no prescription of what to do in the New Testament. But if we have a descriptive part, that's only one in the New Testament.
Other than give.
I think that there is
That's,
prescriptive.
yeah.
The prescriptive would be to give generously
Yeah.
and to give sacrificially.
Yes,
And to
sort of
live in
a
such
certain
a way-
percentage or,
Yeah.
or a certain amount of
To
any
live in
kind.
such a way
Yeah.
that you are able to do that, to make choices with regards to lifestyle, contentment, other expenditures.
Yeah.
Live simply so that what God has blessed you with, you are able to do well with. Recognize that you are a steward of everything that you have, including the gifts that God has given you that are your ability to earn money. And so then that money is something that is you're called to steward and not own. So there is an element of, I think, recognition that everything ultimately belongs to Christ and to God, not just because God is the bestower of gifts, of every good and perfect gift comes from the Father, but also in the sense that you have been bought with a price, right?
Yeah.
So I was created by God. He's the one in whose image I am made. Therefore, I belong to him. There's also the sense of that I've been bought with a price that reinforces that original calling from the book of Genesis to live that life of stewarding that has been lost. So I would agree it's not 10%, and I'm not legalistic with regards to the 10% at all. But I think there are some definite, you can't find a number.
No.
But you can find some specific admonitions to ways of living.
Yes, that's a much better way of phrasing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have the specific principle. Yep.
Right on. Well, that's probably it for today. So I'm let Kyle go get behind the cameras there as I say thanks for joining us on this episode of Inverted Orthodoxy Podcast. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope that you would visit our website at invertedorthodoxy.com and that you would continue to submit your questions. We love answering them and taking you on these adventures through the faith and trying to figure this out together as well. Give us a like and high five or whatever you do on wherever you find those things. Isn't that a thing? Don't you give high fives? I'm so
Like or review.
Well, I say that each week, but this week I was like,
I don't know that you can give a high five.
You can't do high fives?
I'm unaware of that technology.
Oh, okay. I thought, isn't that a like? Isn't that the same thing? Like thumbs up or a high five? Don't you do those things? I've never obviously given a like to anybody before.
Maybe you should subscribe to our podcast and you should give it a like.
All right, I'll do that. High fives to all of you. See you next week.